So her name is Gladys Aylward, and she lived in the early 1900s. So she was a parlour maid. She was from a family that wasn't very rich. They had to work hard. And when she was only about 14, she had to stop going to school and she had to start working. But when she was a teenager, at some point in her life, she heard the call of God, just like Abraham did. She knew that God wanted her to go to China to tell people there about Jesus. But that's kind of impossible. She really wants to go, but she doesn't have much money, and it costs a lot of money to get to China. But she does what she can do. She goes to a mission. So the mission would send her to China. So she works hard at her studies and at the mission school. But before long, she got taken into the office, called into the office, and she got told that she couldn't stay there anymore. She had failed. She was no good at her study, and they thought it would be better for somebody else to take her place because she was no good at doing the study. She wasn't good at schoolwork, and they thought, well, she's already getting old now. And so they think, oh, she's too old to be able to learn a language because Chinese is a difficult language. So they said, well, I'm sorry, but I don't think you're the right person to go. And she was so disappointed because she's really wants to go to China. She's wanted to go for a long time. And yeah, there just seems to be no way. Her one way of going through the mission school, that's not working. She's failed there. So she's extremely disappointed and she doesn't know how is she ever going to get there. But anyway, the man from the mission said he could see how disappointed she was. And he said, well, there is something you could do. And Gladys's ears pricked up. He said, there is a missionary couple who have just come back from China and they need a maid. You could be a maid for them. And poor Gladys, her heart just sunk. So she's no good at training to be a missionary. Now she's just got a job again as a parlour maid. And she was very disappointed. It seemed like her dream of going to China would never come true. But she took the job and she went and stayed with these people. And they could tell her all about China. And while she was there, she learned to do something else. Because where she was living, there were a lot of girls who would come to town. And then they would end up getting into trouble. And so Gladys, since she wasn't going to China right now, she was able to get a job with like a mission, a rescue mission, and they would try to rescue these girls from being on the streets and from being misused or abused, and so she would help these people. So this was something that she could do right now in England. So she did that, but still she really wanted to go to China, and she realized the only way she was going to get there is if she earned her own money to go. So she needed to get a better paying job, so she went back to London again, where she'd come from. And so now she's getting a different job, and she got a job for somebody called Sir Francis' young husband. And so she's going to work for him, and what she didn't know was that he was an explorer. And so he had been to China and other places. So this was one way God was preparing her to go. So anyway, when she got that job, she had paid most of her money that she'd saved up to get there, to go, like, I think, on the train. And so she gets there. She goes in her little room, her little maid's room, and she pulls out her Bible. She pulls out the little bit of money she has left, and she prays. And she says, God, here's my Bible. Here's my money. Here's me. Please use me. And just then there was a knock at the door, and it was another maid who had actually heard Gladys's prayer. And she says, Lady Annabelle wants to see you. Lady Annabelle was the lady of the house. And so Gladys went to go see what she wanted. And Lady Annabelle said, how much did it cost you to come here? And Gladys was surprised. And so she told her how much money it cost her to travel there. And Lady Annabelle paid her back the money that it cost, and even a little bit more. She said, oh, I always pay for my maids to get here for their travelling expenses. So Gladys Aylward was really amazed because she just prayed a few minutes ago And already she had a whole lot more money than what she did. So anyway, she's working hard. She's saving money. She's trying to get any extra work that she can. And she thought, when I get to a certain amount, when I get to £30, I'll go down to the shipping agency and see how much a ticket is. So when she'd saved up to £30, she went down to the shipping agency. And she said to the man there, how much does a ticket cost to China? And he looked at her and he said, which part? And she said, oh, well, she hadn't really thought about where in China she would go. She didn't even know where she would go once she got there, since she wasn't going with the mission board. So she said, I don't know, just anywhere. What's the cheapest ticket? And he said that the cheapest boat would be £90. And this was to go anywhere in China, £90. Gladys Aylward had £30. So it would take a very long time to save up to £90. And she said, well, isn't there any cheaper way? And you know, this man, he looked at her and she looked so poor. She wasn't very rich. She was just a working woman. And he thought she was actually just kind of joking, pretending she was rich, wanting to go on a journey. And he was like, can you just go away? And she said, no, look, I really want to go to China. Do you have any cheaper ticket? And he said, well, you could go by a train. That would be £47. But you wouldn't get there alive. She was like, what? Now, there was a war in between where she lived in China. And so he said it would be very dangerous. You probably wouldn't get there alive. And she said, well, it is my life. You don't have to worry about that. I want to start an account. I want to open an account and I'm going to deposit the £30 and I'm going to come in every week to pay more money for my ticket. And so she did. So she worked really hard, but she thought, what can I do to prepare myself to go to China? So she thought, well, if I go to China, I'm going to tell people about Jesus, so I need to start practicing now. So she went downtown and there was like a soapbox type thing somewhere where people would stand up in the street and tell people what they thought about different things, and people would stop and listen to them. So she thought, well, I'll go down there and I'll start telling people about God. And so she did. Nobody stopped and listened to her, but for her it was really good practice, and also she learned not to worry so much about what people thought of her. And now remember, she's living at a man's house who has been exploring in China. So she said to him, could I please borrow your books about China? And he was a bit surprised because usually maids didn't want to read books from his library, but he said, yep, you can borrow books from my library. So while she was working hard trying to earn the money, she was also learning all she could about China. And you know what? God could have just supplied the money that she needed. Sometimes he does that. But it must have been what God wanted for her to take the time to work hard and to prepare herself. So when the time came, she would be ready. So after about 7 months, she had just about enough money, but she still didn't know where she would go in China, what she would do there. But one day, she heard something. Now, God already knew everything. God knew where she was going to go, but he hadn't told Gladys Aylward just yet. But one day, she heard somebody talking about a lady who had just gone back to China. So she'd come back to England, and her husband had died, and she'd gone back to China, and her name was Jeannie Lawson. And this lady just happened to talk about this lady, Jeannie Lawson, and how Jeannie Lawson had needed somebody to help her in China, but when she was in England, she couldn't find anybody. Now, Gladys heard that, and she said, oh, that's me. And the lady was like, what? And Gladys said, that's me. I want to go to China, and I need a place to go. I need somewhere to go. And so that lady gave her the details of Jeannie Lawson. And so Gladys wrote a letter and arranged a time to come to China. So finally, she was able to go. And on the way, she met a special couple who were from Holland, and they were Christian as well. And so they were very interested to hear all of Gladys's plans and what she was wanting to do in China. And they promised to pray for her every night at 9 p.m. when they got home. So that was very special for her. Somebody along the way who encouraged her and promised to pray for her every night. And then they also gave her some money. So that was just the beginning of her journey to China. It took a long time to get there, and because of the war, it was quite a rough ride getting there. And as they got closer and closer, there were a lot of soldiers on the train because other people weren't wanting to travel then. But she did eventually and safely get there. So when she got there, she had to find Jenny Lawson. And what they did there to try to reach the Chinese people is they made an inn, like a motel for the mule drivers who would travel over the mountain with their mules and carrying stuff. And so they thought, this is a way we can get to know people and tell them about Jesus. So it was called the Inn of 8 Happinesses. And so Gladys would, as she learned Chinese, soon she could know the language well enough to teach them Bible stories. So they'd come here to stay, and they would get Bible stories as well and learn about Jesus. But Gladys hadn't been there for very long before Jenny Lawson died. And then Gladys was in a predicament because she had to pay taxes for the inn and she had no money. And so she was praying about that, thought, how can I pay taxes? How can I be a missionary at the same time? Where do I get the money from? And then there was a knock at the door, and it was the Mandarin. He was like kind of the governor of the area. And he said to her, I want you to be my foot inspector. Now, that sounds strange, but in China at the time, there was a custom that girls, when they were young, they would bind up their feet because they thought that big feet were ugly and that little feet were beautiful. And so they would bind up the girls' feet, and so their feet wouldn't be able to grow properly. And that's a really horrible thing because the girls would have very painful feet, and when they're older, they'd have to hobble around. They wouldn't be able to walk properly. But now there was a new rule that had done away with that custom, and people weren't allowed to do it anymore. And so the Mandarin was saying, I want you to be my foot inspector. I want you to travel around to all the different places, and I want you to make sure that people are obeying the new rule. And she was a bit confused for a moment. She thought, well, I'm not here to be a foot inspector. I'm here to be a missionary and to tell people about Jesus. But remember, she's just been praying for money. So she says to him, well, if I'm allowed to tell people about Jesus as I travel around and as I do my job, then I will do it. And he said, I don't care what you tell people. I just want you to do the job. And so Gladys Aylward was paid to be a foot inspector, to travel all around, and she had soldiers with her too to make sure the people did listen, and she could tell people about Jesus as she went. But now one day something quite frightening happened. She got another visit, and it was the Mandarin again. And he said, you've got to come with me, quick. And so she follows, and she gets taken to the prison. And as she's going there, she can hear screams and yells. And there's a big, crazy fight. There's a riot in the prison. And the Mandarin said to her, I need you to go in there and calm the men down. And she said, what? I can't do that. Why can't you do that? And he said, well, they'll kill me. And she's like, well, what about me? And he says, well, you talk about your God, how great he is. He can protect you. Now, Gladys was terrified of going in there with these crazy men who were killing each other and hurting each other, attacking each other. But she thought, this man is right. I do have a God who can help protect me. And so she had to choose to put her trust in God, even though she had to risk her own life. And she walked into the prison. And when she walked into the prison, it was a horrible sight. There were people, dead people and injured people. And a man came running towards her with an axe. And he had it up over his head. And she felt terrified. But then suddenly she felt sorry for all these men. And she actually felt quite angry. And she said, give me the axe. And the man got kind of such a fright that he did give it to her. And then she talked to those men and said, why are you fighting? And they said, because we're bored, we're hungry, we're cold, we got nothing to do. That's why we're going crazy. And so she went and talked to the Mandarin and made sure that conditions in the prison were changed so that those men weren't going crazy, so that they were fed and they were taken care of and they had something profitable to do. But over time, there was a big war and bombs started falling right where Gladys Aylward lived. And she had taken in children. And because of this war, there were a lot of kids who had lost their parents. So they all came to her. But she had to get them to a safer place. So she couldn't stay in the inner eight happiness anymore. She had to take them over the mountains. And you know, she had 100 children she had to take over the mountains. And she's got no car, no airplane or anything. They've got to go on foot. Some of these girls have got very sore feet, so it's very hard, very painful. And there are enemy planes flying over, so every now and again they've got to dive for shelter. So anyway, they go, and finally they go into a certain town to where there's an orphanage, so that's a safer place. So as they're traveling along, they come to the Yellow River. And they need to cross the Yellow River. But when they get there, there is no way across. There's no boats. There's no nothing. And it's dangerous. There are enemy soldiers, you know, not far away. And one of the little boys said to Gladys Aylward, remember Moses? God made a way through the Red Sea. Why can't God do the same for us? And Gladys Aylward said, well, I'm not Moses. And that little child said, but God is still God. God can help us. And so that encouraged Gladys. And so they waited. And before long, some Chinese soldiers came with a boat. And they got the children across the river. And so then they had to go on a train. But then the bridge was bombed. And they had to walk another 5 days to the next train. So it was just like one problem after another, and they don't have a whole lot of food. They're tired and they're sore, so they've got to travel another 5 days to the next train. But when they get there, there's only coal trains going. And so first it's like, oh no, we can't even go on the train. What are we going to do now? But then the men from the train said, well, you can travel on top of the coal. So all those children had to get up on top of the coal. They got covered in coal dust, came all black. But you know what? That was actually a good thing, because when the enemy planes flew over, they didn't see the children there because the children were all black and just looked like coal. Anyway, they finally got to the town where they were going, and they got told, there's too many refugees. There's too many orphans here. You can't stay here. We don't have space for you. Poor Gladys, what a nightmare. So they had to keep on going down the train, down the lines to the next town, to Fufeng, and there was an orphanage that could take all the children. But by now Gladys was very tired, and she was very sick too. But God had kept her and the children safe. Nobody had died. They were all safe. She got them all safely to the orphanage, 100 children. So she had to go back to England, and she had to recover because she was sick and tired. But later on, when she was better, she went back to China again, and she started another orphanage for children.